Okay, chapter 2 is the search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in somber spirits. How did he feel? He was feeling pretty down after hearing everything that he heard from Enfield. Okay? He sat down to dinner without relish. It was his custom of a Sunday, when the meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighboring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. That's what he normally did. But on this night, however, as soon as the clock was taken away, he took up a candle and went to his business room. Now remember, we're in the middle of the 1800s. There's no light switch to turn on. There's no electricity, okay? He gets a candle and lights it and goes to his business room, which we commonly call an office, okay? So he had an office or a study inside his house, okay? There, he opened his safe. He took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will. And he sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. Okay? Something made him want to go back in to that safe in the middle of the night and pull this document and read it. You wonder why, What about the will is bothering Mr. Utterson? Okay? The will was a holograph, meaning it was a copy. It was not the original. For Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. Okay? So he wasn't involved in the original creation of the will, but he took the copy of it and kept it in his safe. Okay? It provided not only that in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, M.D., D.C.L., LLD, F.R.S., and Company, all of his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. Strange. But that in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, this said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. So, Mr. Hyde is inheriting everything from Dr. Jekyll. Even if Dr. Jekyll just goes missing, or if he disappears for a period of time, Mr. Hyde is supposed to be allowed to step right in and take over the running of the household, to pay the servants their paychecks, to keep his household going. That's written into his will. Do y'all think that's kind of weird?
Very much.
Okay. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. Utterson has not liked this document since the first time he laid his eyes on it. Remember, he's a lawyer. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation, because he felt like he should know this man. If this man has this much influence and power with Dr. Jekyll, then Utterson should know about it, because Dr. Jekyll is his client. He should know who the benefactor is, or who is going to be standing to get all of Dr. Jekyll's money. He should have known personally who this Mr. Hyde is. And he's furious about the fact that he didn't know. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. A fiend is an evil being, right? It's the opposite of a friend. It's a fiend, evil. Now, this end of this paragraph implies Mr. Utterson, he had seen the name Mr. Hyde for a long time, and he was mad because he didn't know the man. But now that he knows what kind of man this is, it makes him even angrier that this man would be the one chosen to receive all of Dr. Jekyll's money. Okay? You can see why he would be really upset about it. Because he's a man that has affections for all of his clients. He cares about people. He wants everybody to do the right thing. And when he sees this happening, he's upset. Okay? I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper back into the safe. And now I begin to fear its disgrace. With that, he blew out his candle, put on his great coat, that means his big, heavy outerwear coat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it'll be Lanyon, he thought. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered directly from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hardy, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman, with a shock of hair prematurely white, and a boisterous and decided manner. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye. He was very dramatic. But it reposed on genuine feeling. For these two were old friends, old mates, both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and, what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. They were truly the best of friends. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably occupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," said he, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon, "but I suppose we are." "And what of that? I see little of him now." "Indeed," said Utterson. "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it was more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man." "Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have estranged Damon and Pythias." Damon and Pythias are references to, anybody know? It's an allusion to a Greek myth. Y'all done Greek mythology yet?
Something like that. Something like that.
Are you in the middle of it?
I like starting it.
You don't claim it?
We don't like
I don't like
Y'all don't like it?
No.
It's like a bunch of soap operas, those Greek myths.
it.
They're really good.
Who wants to hear a soap opera?
Oh, I love soap operas. Do you like drama?
The Young and the Restless.
No, mine is not The Young and the Restless. I'm a General Hospital fan.
General Hospital.
Yes,
Grey's Anatomy.
yes. In the daytime. Yeah, everybody likes a little drama. But anyway, Damon and Pythias were lovers. Okay.
Wait, who?
And Damon and Pythias. Gotta look them up. A Greek goddess. Okay. But he's saying here, when he's talking about them, he says, this unscientific balderdash would have estranged even Damon and Pythias, would have made them grow apart. Okay, this scientific balderdash. Evidently they had an argument over something to do with science, he and Dr. Jekyll, and they had a parting of ways because they couldn't agree. Okay, so they are no longer friends. Dr. Lanyon hadn't even talked to him in like 10 years. Okay, so that's how we're explaining that. But you need to look up Damon and Pythias one of these days. Not right now, though, because we've got more of the story to listen to. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. He was kind of glad that Dr. Lanyon was a little mad about what was going on, because it kind of made him feel like, okay, my emotions are I'm right to be upset too. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought. And being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyances, he even added, it is nothing worse than that. He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure and then approached the question that he had come to put. Did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde? He asked. Hyde? Repeated Lanyon. No, never heard of him. Since my time. That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination was also engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night and curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, a city at night. Then of the figure of a man walking swiftly. Then of a child running from the doctors. Then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. He's replaying it in his mind. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling in his dreams, and then the door of the room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given. And even at that dead hour, he must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, the figure of Mr. Hyde. And if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through the sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamplighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. He's having nightmares about this crazy man. And still, the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams, it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. He was dying to know what the guy looked like. If he could but once set eyes on him, He thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it what you please, and even for the startling clauses of the will. And at least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable infield a spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city or the fogged city moon, and by all lights and all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. So he started hanging around at that old doorway, trying to catch a glimpse so he could see Mr. Hyde in the flesh. Because he had just been told the story, He was not a part of when it actually happened. He was just hearing Mr. Enfield tell the story. So he wanted to see this guy for himself, what he really looked like. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. Don't you like that play on words? If he's going to hide, I'm going to be Mr. Seek. And at last, his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when shops were closed, the by-street very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Where am I? Small sounds carried far.
Yeah, the domestic sounds. The house repaired.
Oh, there it is. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumor of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he's still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. He had been hanging out there for so long, and he was so accustomed to the sounds that he could pick up when a singular person was coming towards him, because he'd been listening, day after day, night after night out there in the alleyway. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps grew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned to the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket, like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath, like that. But with his fear was only momentary. And though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" I see you're going in, returned the lawyer. I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me. I thought you'd invite me in. That's what he's saying. You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home, replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, how did you know me? He asked. On your side, said Mr. Utterson. Will you do me a favor? With pleasure, said the other. What shall it be? Will you let me see your face? Asked the lawyer. Y'all sit up. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, he fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. Now I shall know you again, said Mr. Utterson. It may be useful. Yes, returned Mr. Hyde. It is as well we have met, and apropos, you should have my address. So he gave him a number of a street in Soho. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson. Can he too have been thinking of the will? But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgement of the address. And now, said the other, how did you know me? By description, was the reply. Whose description? We have common friends, said Mr. Utterson. He wasn't going to tell him. Common friends, echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. Who are they? Jekyll, for instance, said the lawyer. He never told you, cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. I did not think you would have lied. Come, said Mr. Utterson. That is not fitting language. The other snarled around in a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood a while. When Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two, and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust and loathing and fear with which Utterson regarded him. There must be something else, said the perplexed gentleman. There is something more. If I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think. For, oh my poor Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. Round the corner from the by-street, there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers. They were old houses that were made into apartments. To all sorts and conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire. That means it was not made into apartments. At the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall, paved with flags, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you the light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, which was rare for him, nausea and distaste of life. And in the gloom of his spirits, he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and uneasy starting of the shadow of the roof. He was ashamed of his belief when Poole pleasantly returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door, Poole," he said. "Is that right? When Dr. Jekyll is from home?" So apparently now we know the blistered door is actually the old door to the dissecting room in the back of Dr. Jekyll's house. Okay? So picture this. Let's say Dr. Jekyll's house is right here on this current strip of road, okay, in the middle of a metropolitan city. And the house actually stretches, it's narrow, and it stretches all the way to the next block. Okay, so the back of the house is on another street. The front of the house is on this street. The back of the house has the old nasty blistered door. The front of the house is his nice, beautiful entrance. Okay, are y'all picturing it now? So now we know when Mr. Hyde was going in and out, he was going into Dr. Jekyll's dissecting door. Because when you were a doctor, your office and your laboratory was oftentimes, in the back of your house. You didn't have a separate office. Just like Mr. Utterson's office is at his house. That's just how they did it in the 1800s. There might not have been room to have a separate office. Or they may have worked so much that they lived at their office, because they would work if they got an idea, they'd get up, even if it was in the middle of the night, they'd get up and work. So that's one thing we have figured out. So let me back up a little bit. I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door. Is that right? Should he be doing that if Dr. Jekyll is not home? Is what he's asking. "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he do indeed," said Poole. "We have all orders to obey him." "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde," asked Utterson. "Oh dear, no, sir, he never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory." "Well, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought. "My mind misgives me he is in deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago, to be sure, but in the law of God, there is no statute of limitations. Ah, it must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming pede quado, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault." So he's thinking here that Henry Jekyll is into some trouble, maybe. Maybe he got into some trouble that Hyde knows about, and Hyde is kind of blackmailing him, you know. That may be how Hyde has power over him and is able to have a key and able to be listed in the will. And maybe Dr. Jekyll is in trouble and Hyde is holding it over his head. And the lawyer, scared by that thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of memory, lest, by chance, some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension. Yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So he's thinking about all the bad choices he made in his life. And he's thinking, yeah, I made a bunch. I was wild. I made some mistakes. But he also remembered that in his life, there were things that he could have done, things he was tempted to do, but he was able to avoid them. Okay? So he's just thinking about the evil deeds of man, you know, and how we all fall into it. And he's thinking that, yeah, I had my share of temptations, and I fell to some. But I'm impressed by the fact that I was able to avoid some. All right, and then by a return on his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. This Master Hyde, if he were studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. And when he says black secrets, he means dark, deep, hidden secrets, okay? Opposite of the sunshine, okay? Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think this creature's stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, Dr. Jekyll. What awakening, and the danger of it. For if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit it. Ah, I must put my shoulder to the wheel if Jekyll will but let me, he added. If Jekyll will only let me. For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clean as a transparency, the strange clauses of the will. Because what's he afraid Mr. Hyde's going to do to Dr. Jekyll? If he finds out he's the one that could inherit everything, what might he do? Kill him. Okay. All right.